Welcome to the Rich Report, a podcast with news and information on the world of high-performance computing. Today, my guest is from Penguin Computing. We have Arend Dittmer. So, Arend, welcome to the show today.
Hi, Rich. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Well, thanks for coming on, Arend. You know, we saw the news from Penguin about the new Artica switches, and I thought these were rather interesting because they have a non-proprietary Linux-based operating system. But why don't we go through your slides and you can tell us more?
Sure, absolutely. So let's start with the first slide. So what we're seeing in the network world is actually similar to what we're seeing in what we saw in the server world about 20 years ago. The network industry is undergoing a paradigm shift, moving away from traditional proprietary vertically integrated stacks from single vendors with hardware and software provided from one vendor to a more open ecosystem that's much more diverse, where you have standardized so-called merchant silicons from vendors like Broadcom or Marvell. Then you have industry standard switches from original design manufacturers that are now accessible through companies like Penguin. You know, this new paradigm with companies such like Cumulus Linux. And the whole idea is that users have more choice now with this open ecosystem. So you can decide which switch hardware you want, but that doesn't necessarily tie you to a specific switch operating system. So it provides much more flexibility and choice for customers, and opens up the ecosystem, and should also eventually drive down price. So as I said, our Arctica line of network switches are industry standard switches that are part of this new ecosystem. And the first software stacks we're offering for our Arctica switch line is switch software from Cumulus Linux, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, and Broadcom. And what's interesting to know about this particular about Cumulus Linux is that the control and management planes are native Linux, while the data path is still accelerated using switching silicon. So the actual ASICs that handle, for example, the packet routing at a low level at layer 1, that is still industry standard silicon. Nothing changes there. It's just that, as I said, the ecosystem is opening up, and we're going from vertically integrated single vendor solution to open multi-vendor solutions that offer more choice. If we look at this new paradigm, one thing to keep in mind, though, is that there has to be some enabler. If you want to build a software ecosystem around industry standard hardware, you have to find a standardized way of getting this software onto the hardware, and that's where the open network install environment comes to play. This is an open source initiative that was initiated by Cumulus, and it defines a standardized software installation environment for bare metal network switches. So the idea is that different software vendors, such as Cumulus or other players that are going to enter the market, can build on a standardized installation environment for their software. So this is basically the key to enabling this open ecosystem, to define a standard and makes it easy for new players in the software area to enter this market. If we look at the model, we have the control plane functionality that's defined by the switch software. So we're talking route distribution and management of VLANs and link aggregation negotiation. That happens in the control plane, and that's where Cumulus Linux comes to play. So we have a CPU and a system on chip that runs Cumulus Linux, a full-blown Linux operating system with a standard Linux look and feel. And then for the actual lower level routing, we have a switching ASIC that handles that connected through PCIe. And as I said, the open network install environment facilitates the installation of an operating system on the control plane. And the Penguin Arctica switches, this is where it all ties into Penguin, is they support this open network install environment. So basically any software that is compliant to the standard defined by ONIE will be able to run on Penguin Arctica switches. So what are the benefits of this more open networking model? For one, lower capital expenses. So we have industry standard bare metal switch hardware, and that will enable larger economies of scale. It will basically invigorate the market. There will be higher volumes sold of these industry standard switches, less switches containing custom ASICs, and that will drive down cost. Then low operational expenses. So open standards foster ecosystems of open software tools for automation management. For example, if we look at Cumulus Linux as its full-blown Linux operating system, you could use configuration management tools like Chef and Puppet that you already have in your large-scale environment, and provision and manage your switches and your switch configurations with those existing tools. So in general, this is just one example, but in general, it's fair to say that open standards promote ecosystems and growth of open software tools, and also reuse of existing recipes, and overall that will result in lower operational expenses. And then, of course, more flexible. Inherently to the openness is that it is easier to customize these network stacks. So organizations can tailor them to their own needs to meet their specific requirements. To the point of capital expense and lower capital expense with this new networking model, if we look specifically at Penguin Arctica, we see on the left side a comparison comparing a Cisco Nexus 3064 10 gigabit Ethernet switch that has exactly the same capabilities as the Arctica 4804X. That's our 48-port 10 gigabit Ethernet switch. And what you see is that basically for the cost of software and support on the Cisco side, you can buy the hardware and the software all turnkey integrated from Penguin Computing. And on the right side, you see that where we see a comparison of a Cisco 3048 1 gigabit switch with a 10 gigabit Arctica 4804. We see that you basically get, for the price of a 1 gigabit Cisco switch, you can get a 10 gigabit Penguin Arctica switch. So the initial acquisition cost is really drastically lower than, for the Arctica line, is drastically lower than the acquisition cost for switches of established vendors like Cisco. So really getting 10 gigabit for the cost of 1 gig is, I think, a very compelling value proposition. So if we look at the Penguin Arctica offering, so we have initially we'll have 2, and at the end of Q4 we'll have 3 different switches. I'll provide more detail about that in a couple of slides. Those are high performance level 2, level 3 switches. It's important that we don't just provide the switches, we provide the switch hardware, the software, as well as cabling transceiver accessories that are required. Also important to note that we don't try to lock customers in by forcing them to use specific cables and transceivers specifically with certain vendor codes in them and preventing them from using cables with different vendor codes. So there is no lock-in here, but we do provide cable and transceiver accessories. As I said, there's a variety of software options, and very important, we are the single throat to choke. So Penguin Computing offers support for the complete solution, enterprise level support at the highest level, 24/7 support for the complete package, hardware and software. So you can take advantage of the lower price, the flexibility of the open ecosystem, but you don't have to compromise as far as support is concerned. So if we look at the hardware, 3 different offerings, 1 gigabit, 10 gigabit, and 40 gigabit Ethernet switches based on the Broadcom Trident Plus chipsets. Those are the chipsets I mentioned earlier in the architecture diagram, the ASICs that handle the low-level routing that are connected to the control plane to the PCIe bus. So they handle the data plane functionality, for example, packet lookup and manipulation. That's all the standard Broadcom silicon that I call merchant silicon that's used by the ODMs producing these switches. We have the form factor is 1 rack unit, nothing special there. We have 2 different airflow options, front to rear, rear to front. The switches offer redundant power supplies. The product lines are interoperable, compatible with SFP+, and they're, as we saw earlier, very, very cost-effective solution. So the 4804i is a 48-port gigabit Ethernet switch that provides 4 10-gigabit uplinks. Already went over the specs. We have 3+1 fixed fans, in and out of band management. So industry standard, as I said. The 4804X is a 48-port 10-gigabit switch with SFP+ connectors, airflow options front to back, back to front, redundant power supplies and fans. Very comparable to other offerings you find in the market. And then at the end of Q4, we'll have a 40 gigabit switch in our portfolio with 32 QSFP ports. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about the switches. We provide the complete offering. So we have direct attached cables, Cat6, RG45, of course, optical cables, SR, LR transceivers, and 40 gigabit Ethernet transceivers. Again, I want to reiterate, we're not trying to lock customers to expensive proprietary transceivers and cables. Everything is open and interoperable. If we compare standard 4804X, our 10 gigabit Ethernet switch with a 7050 from Arista, for example, basically see that the specs are pretty much identical, which you can draw your own conclusions from, but the whole point is a lot of the established vendors already use industry standard hardware as the building block, and the difference to the new model is that we actually make this industry standard hardware available with software to choose from that we provide full support for at a much lower price point. So to sum things up, what I'd like you to take home from this podcast is that the world of network switches is opening up. So industry standard type of hardware is now accessible directly to end customers through companies like Penguin Computing. A new software ecosystem is evolving, as I mentioned earlier, comparable to how we moved from proprietary Linux or Unix hardware and proprietary Unixes to Linux about 20 years ago. We see a parallel development in the world of network switches. The world is opening up. There's going to be more software choice for customers. And key to enabling this open ecosystem is the standardized open network installation environment that basically enables these different software options. And by the way, the open network installation environment is an industry consortium that is supported by all major players. Penguin Arctica switches are part of this new ecosystem, providing more choice at hardware and also at a software level, and providing full support. Hardware and software support, as I said, provided by Penguin at the enterprise level, 24/7. Arctica enables drastic cost savings. We saw a cost comparison between Cisco and Arctica. We saw that you can basically get a 10 gigabit Arctica for the cost of a 1 gigabit Cisco switch, including support. Current software options on the Arctica line are Cumulus and Broadcom. We're talking to a number of other software vendors that are going to be part of that ecosystem. And if you need support for something that is not here, that's not Cumulus or Broadcom, please talk to us. I'm sure we will find a way to help you out. And the current hardware options are the 48-port gigabit and 10 gigabit, and coming late Q3, the 32-port 40 gigabit. So that was it. Thank you very much for listening in.
Well, thanks, Arend. A couple questions come to mind. You didn't talk about markets. Is this primarily a cloud computing play, or do you think the HPC cluster folks will be interested?
I actually think it's a pretty broad market, just through the sort of compelling, price performance that these switches offer.
Yeah.
So I think there is an enterprise as well as an HPC play here.
Yeah. And to that end, you guys, of course, have the Penguin On Demand, which you've been involved with for a long time, the HPC cloud. Will you be deploying these switches in that environment?
Yes, we have plans to deploy them in that environment. And what makes particularly Cumulus so interesting is the fact that it's not just something Linux-based, it's really a full-blown Linux. And the implication of that is that you can use the standard management tools that you already have in an infrastructure, and sysadmins that don't necessarily have to understand the command line interface of the Cisco switch operating system. So that's to the point of low operational expense. I think it will help us a lot with the automation and also with the creation of, for example, VLANs on the fly, to be able to script configurations and manage them centrally by tools we already have. So we're definitely looking at deploying that on pod.
Okay. And then, we hear a lot about software-defined networking, and in fact, some of the podcasts I've done about that have gotten a lot of attention. Does that have a role here with as these machines start to open up the network devices?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I can't say too much about partners we're talking to right now, but that's definitely one thing we're exploring, and the Arctica switches would be a great platform for software-defined networking, absolutely.
Well, terrific. Well, Arend, you guys are known for your expertise in Linux, of course, for many years, and this seems to be a nice natural extension. So congratulations on this new line of business.
Great. Thank you, Rich.
You bet. All right. Well, thanks again for coming on, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you and kind of take a closer look at these at the supercomputing show coming up in Denver.
Absolutely. We'll have switches on display there, and we'll have folks that know all about them. So, please swing by.
For sure. Will do. Okay, folks, that's it for the Rich Report. Stay tuned for more news and information on high-performance computing.